All right, let's talk about solving this quadratic equation using the completing the square, specifically the part in WAMAP where they ask you to enter the factored form where they have this x plus d squared equals e. And we'll come back to that form in a second. But let's talk about the process. First of all, if you want to solve by completing the square, what you do is you first get rid of or you move over this constant coefficient. So what I'm going to do is add 120 to both sides of this equation, and I get this right here. Okay, the idea of completing the square is I am going to add a constant to this right-hand side, or left-hand side, excuse me, over here, so this becomes a perfect square trinomial. I want to take just a half second and talk about what a perfect square trinomial is. Something like, let's take this, x squared plus 6x plus 9 is a perfect square trinomial because it's the result of multiplying x plus 3 times itself. Or, in other words, it's x plus 3 squared. What happens is anytime you take a binomial like this and you square it, which you have to turn it into this first before you FOIL it or you multiply it into this, the idea is that whatever you square, you always get the same pattern. This middle number is twice that number, and this constant coefficient is that number squared. That's just the result of what happens when you end up multiplying a binomial by itself. In fact, anytime you create a quadratic that looks like this, and you have that same relationship between this coefficient, this linear coefficient here, and the constant coefficient, to where there's this underlying number that when you double it becomes 6, and you square it becomes that, it'll always be a perfect square trinomial. And and at the risk of kind of going too much on a tangent here, for instance, if you had x squared plus 10x, what you'd want to add on here would be 25. And what that would be is x plus 5 squared. Okay, let's go back to the problem at hand. So we solve the problem at hand by adding what we, this thing on here. What we want is we take the 2, we divide it by 2 to find the number in the background. That would be a 1, and we square 1. 1 squared is just 1. So actually what we're going to do is we're just going to add a 1 on there. Over here on the right-hand side, we add a 1 also. Okay, then what we've done, really the big work of completing the square, what we do now is we factor this side. Now we know this side over here is not 0, but we factor it. We don't need it to be 0 when we use this technique. This factors into x plus 1 times x plus 1, or in other words, x plus 1 squared. And again, if you're kind of skeptical of that, you could always multiply x plus 1 times x plus 1 and verify that it becomes this thing right here. On the right-hand side, we get 121. Now, this is actually the point where we have this factored form. The d, in our case, in this case, the d would have been a 1, and the e value here on the other side of the equation is 121. Just to clarify that, this would be what WAMAP wants in the first box right there. And then we solve this by taking the square root. I'll just finish this pretty quick because the question wasn't about how to solve it from here. But what you do is you take the square root of both sides and you get x plus 1 equals plus or minus 11. The square root of 121 is 11. This gives us two equations, x plus 1 equals 11 and x plus 1 equals negative 11. Subtracting 1 gets us our two answers. We have x equals, is it 0? Oh, that's 11. What am I doing? Sorry. X equals 10. And over here, we get x equals negative 12. Those are our two answers using the completing the square method.